It's a scary thing to be introduced as an institution by someone who is not here. But I am glad to be here, and I'm glad that you're here too. Mr. Chairman, Dr. McCrae, and fellow lecturers, ladies and gentlemen, it was a delight for me to be asked to come and address this topic of perspectives on faith, and particularly this evening, in reference and in context with the university chaplaincy. It is commonplace but apt to describe a university as a crucible. For this is the place where those seeking post-secondary education initiate lifelong goals, establish their vocation or profession, and develop not only the standards and values which they will decide to be non-negotiable in their life, that's a very important decision, but also their relationship with what we call creation, and if they believe in their Creator. In other words, I'd see it as a nurturing ground for what, in the best sense of the word and yet very broad sense of the word, we can deem to be their faith. A part, and I think it's an essential part from our point of view, of this life formation is the faith which they will profess more or less for the rest of their lives. It's not that we don't continue to grow, it's not that we don't mature and we polish those ideas and thoughts and beliefs that we have. We do that. But the foundation stones are often, mostly laid for those who attend university during this time. There was one book which I read over the summer. It took me a long time to read it. It was a hard book to read, one I've meant to read for some time too. In fact, I started it several times and then would put it down. It's by John Henry Newman, which is entitled The Idea of a University. It was written in 1852. And in it, John Henry Newman asks, "For why do we educate except to prepare for the world?" I was just reading this over a little bit earlier, just after chapel this evening, actually, and then I thought, I wonder how many of you know about John Henry Newman, and I thought I'd better give you a little synopsis of who he is. He was born in 1801 in England, died in 1890. He was brought up as an evangelical Church of England, with an evangelical Church of England family. Then he entered the flesh pots of Oxford at Trinity College and was seduced by the spiritual sources there. He was ordained a deacon of the Anglican Church in 1824. Now remember that he'd be 23 years of age at that point. 1832-33, he toured Europe. This was a formative time because when he returned, he was no longer any capitally evangelical, but had gone over more to the Oxford movement. In fact, became a leading light of the Oxford movement. Do you understand what that is? In the Church of England, the High Church movement. And he went through a tumultuous time during that. Many things were written, including those notorious tracts, especially tract number 90. And finally, after much agony himself, as well as being criticized heavily for his views within the Anglican Church, on the 9th of October, 1845, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church. He was ordained in Rome and became a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. 1845. It is after that, it's 1852, that this book that I'm quoting liberally this evening was written. And it was written because he was asked to examine the idea of a Roman Catholic university in Ireland, and eventually became rector of it, Dublin University, 1854 to 1858. It was not a happy time. He didn't stay terribly long. In 1879, he became a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. And when I was reading this up this evening in the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, which is a wonderful book, by the way, And the volume I have, just out of side interest, was given to me by the Anglican Church in Amherst after doing a Christian education program for them. In Amherst, the Anglican Church literally is at the back door and in the shadow of the Baptist Church. And I was over to do some, and I was the Minister of CE in Amherst at the time, and they gave me this volume, and it's been an invaluable volume for me, and I would suggest it for anybody's library. It concludes this little article by saying his genius has come to be more and more recognized after his death, and that was certainly true. If you read the idea of university, you have to sift from it this history. There is a lot of stuff in it that obviously he is beating the drum for a particular course that he would be interested in, but out of that comes some wonderful ideas, including that, for why do we educate except to prepare for the world? A part, and I think, is to come quickly to the point here that the mission of a true university chaplaincy is to allow this formation to happen, to prepare for the world. And I think that is the mission for these students, for the university chaplaincy. Since the topic we are discussing is a university chaplaincy, and I want you to have that imprinted on your mind, it's a university chaplaincy. It must be understood within the context of the university rather than that of a faith community, or a church, if you like, or whatever. But I say faith community because chaplaincy more and more must be sensitive to other faiths expressions, Islam, Buddhism, so on. We cannot, as a university chaplaincy, be interested in perpetuating ourselves as a church. It is the same Cardinal Newman who writes, "If then a university is a direct preparation for this world, let it be what it professes. It is not a convent. It is not a seminary. It is a place to fit men, and I'm sure you would add today women, of the world for the world." I don't think anybody in their right mind would describe Acadia University as a convent today. If you were tempted, I could take you on a little trip tonight, which might change your view. I had actually, it was very touching. The Don of Chipman House took me out for supper tonight because of this, and I find out a lot of things as it goes along. The traditional concepts, values, and approaches of universities in general, and the particular university involved, must be respected by the individuals who seek to be chaplains. Do you understand what I'm saying? The approach of the university is totally important and must be respected by those who seek to be their chaplains. University education has always approached learning as an art. I say that in a very broad sense. It promotes learning by asking questions, testing the evidence, and deciding what is true. And this is the opinion of no less than John Henry Newman, who wrote that all branches of knowledge are connected together, because the subject matter of knowledge is intimately united in itself as being the acts of the work of the Creator. This consideration, if well-founded, must be taken into account not only as regards the attainment of truth, which is their common end, but as regards the influence which they exercise upon whose education consists in the study of them. The university is a trustee, of course, of previous learning. That's one part of the job of the university, to keep safe the learning of truths that have already been discovered. And it must be saved for those who follow. But even this preserved knowledge must still remain open to testing and trial by application. You understand? This is how a university works. This is not inconsistent, though, with the Christian doctrine of a general and continuing revelation, that new information is continually revealed to the inquiring mind. Progressive knowledge is a part of the human experience as we learn more and more about life. This is just a general philosophy of where a university is. But if we're going to talk about university chaplaincies, we need to understand that. A university chaplaincy, then, encourages this process of spiritual inquiry. It offers guidance and appropriate resources and allows for personal interpretation of what is discovered. I will not tell people how they must form the information they have gathered. They must do that themselves, as they should be doing in any class. Now that we have introduced the subject, let us have some definitions. Let us define some of the terms which we're using, and one of them is university chaplaincy. It is a distinct component belonging to, if it is a university chaplaincy, it must be a distinct component belonging to the university as an academic community, as it is at Acadia, by the way. A real university chaplaincy, that is, one that is a part of the university system, is quite different from a church-sponsored ministry. A university chaplaincy is one which is paid for by the university, staffed by university personnel who have met the university's employment qualifications and standards. And the chaplaincy's earthly responsibility is solely to the university as one of its departments. This is to compare, by the way, with church-related ministries on campus, as they say. It's not a phrase with which I'm too comfortable, but many universities have chaplaincies, but they are paid for by the churches, and they are just people who work on the campus and have no real official part within the university structure, as compared with, say, at Acadia or Mount Allison, where they are definitely a department of the university. Taking the larger suggestion that a university is a crucible, if you accept that, a university chaplaincy becomes a crucible of faith. This is in contrast with any who wish, sometimes in the best sense, sometimes in the worst sense of the words, to propagandize or indoctrinate students with their own version of spirituality and faith. It may be partly distinguished by saying that a university chaplaincy is a ministry, not a mission. It sees the university campus as a place where people need to be served. You must remember that the root word for service or serve is minister. It is not a mission field, as far as the university chaplaincy is concerned, to convert any particular student to any particular brand of religion. Okay, that's what I define as university chaplaincy. Faith. Faith is defined by the concise Oxford Dictionary as reliance or trust in, belief founded on authority. And in theological terms, it would continue to say belief in religious doctrines, especially as affects character and content, spiritual apprehension of divine truth apart from proof, systems of religious belief. Dear old John Henry Newman would warn that undiscerning Christians would misrepresent faith so that, in quotations, it became fashionable to say that faith was not an acceptance of revealed doctrine, not an act of the intellect, but a feeling, an emotion, an affectation, an appetency or longing for. And as this view of faith obtained credence, so was the connection of faith with truth and knowledge more and more either forgotten or denied. I think that is a warning that was given in 1852, which is certainly contemporary for us today. How often faith in many of our churches is considered more a feeling than an intellectual assent. There is a good article on biblical concepts of faith by Daniel N. Schowalter in a book, again, I would recommend to you, The Oxford Companion of the Bible. It's one that's still in print. It's just, actually, is not that old, and I found it very useful. Those are some definitions that I thought might be helpful and to understand the rest of what I'm going to say. The next section is called, for me, Faith and the University. So let us look at the goal of personal growth. We hear about that all the time at university. This is a place to grow, Acadia is called. In 1996, it cannot be assumed that students are entering university with any predetermined concept of faith or religious practice. It is, I believe, to be a conservative estimate to say that 50% of new students, say they came in this September, have no religious tradition or knowledge. I'd almost say that's a very conservative estimate, but at least 50% have no religious tradition or knowledge. I think this should shock even the most secular person or atheist as well as the faithful. For it means that these students coming in have not come to a personal decision about their spiritual life. They haven't even started. This also connotes that these students are almost 100% ignorant of any religious knowledge, of any religious or spiritual formation, or any skill in dealing with the spiritual experiences which they will obviously meet and often meet at university, but will have to meet in their life at some time, such as birth, death, relationships, literature, appreciation of nature, and so forth. One of the things that happen to the students at university often is the death of grandparents. And quite often the death of a grandparent at university is a traumatic event because it's the first time a member of their family they have known personally and intimately has passed away. And over again I have to talk with people who have lost a grandparent. Sometimes it's far more serious than that from our point of view, but it is their first grappling with something spiritual that is mortality. At the time of the terrible tragedy of the blowing off of TWA Flight 800 last summer, there was an irreverent but, I think, insightful article written by Mike Barnacle, I'm not sure if that's his real name, in the Boston Globe in July, this past July. It is entitled, "Only God Knows for Sure, but He Isn't Talking." And he writes about our human spiritual limitations when disasters occur, our typical human response. Part of it says, God sure has been busy these past few days. If you remember those days, there was the terrible explosion. We didn't know if it was a terrorist bomb or the plane had a malfunction or what it was. And people were getting terribly anxious, even if it was a few days, to find the plane and decide exactly what happened. And it didn't matter if it was under a whole pile of feet of water, and find the bodies and so on. You remember that type of instant desire to find out the answer. God has been busy these past few days. He's been mentioned more often than Bob Costas and has had to field more questions than a disc jockey on some of the oldie stations. I don't listen to oldie stations, so I don't know what that means. He goes on in his little article, of course, his, capital H here, God's, his workload increased dramatically as soon as Flight 800 was blown out of the sky. Millions wondered, how could God allow that to happen? And then he goes on, first of all, his, capital H, his name always gets dropped within the context of our worst messes. War, disease, plane crashes, terrorism, death, and violence of all kinds. Predictably, we expect too much, too quickly from him. We want answers, bodies, explanations, and solutions. We want them yesterday because we are impatient, raised in an era when instant gratification has been aligned with a lack of individual accountability that has turned social chaos into an art form. We are like our 4-year-old. Whenever the you-know-what hits the fan, we run crying to him for help, strength and advice, even though we initiated the problem ourselves. It's actually a lovely little article which points out our immaturity in spiritual things as a nation. It is this which the university chaplaincy can attempt to put to right. Only a small minority of our general population in Canada are practicing Christians. Surveys say that between 29 and 31% of Canadians attend a place of worship regularly. Since this includes older and more mature adults who tend to be more religious for a number of reasons, we might assume, although this is a guess on my part, that about 10 to 12% of new students will actively be seeking a spiritual community when they begin university life. I think that's a fairly accurate account, though. Since university encourages questioning and experiment, quite rightly, it is not unlikely that some of these same people who initially want to seek a spiritual community will drop out of a regular religious attendance, at least temporarily, just to see what life is like without it. Actually, since I've been, this is my 12th year here, and it has not been unusual to have 3 or 4 or even more young people, children of the manse actually, at Acadia that I've known personally or known their parents, who never darken the door of the chapel or I'd never see. The parents are often quite embarrassed, and they ask, you know, we're terribly sorry that Johnny or Mary or whoever hasn't been to chapel lately. My only answer to them is maybe this is the first time they've been able to be out of the house, away from home, and try it without the church for just a while. And I don't actually think that's wrong, because I have enough faith, if you like, in our bringing up of our young people in the church, as these people would be, that they will, most of them, come back to it. But they need to do experimental things like that. They need to understand, see what they can do by themselves. The majority of undergraduate students have very little ability to articulate a personal faith. Home life from which they have come increasingly is secularized and vulgar. The public school systems teach next to nothing about spiritual formation and expression. And so this ignorance with which they come to university, in fact, makes students defensive even when they get here and block any learning in this field, fearing that to admit to this lack of knowledge would condemn them in the eyes of believers and non-believers alike for different reasons. Those with even a latent interest in faith can be intimidated by the increasingly passive but yet easy perceived peer pressure of not bothering to think about spirituality. And I've seen that happen over and over again. The lack of desire to explore personal spirituality and religious belief applies not only to those with no religious or spiritual training too, but also, and please listen to me here, to students who believe only what they have been told by others. Left only to this state of affairs, it means they are people who are content to leave their beliefs to being no more than faith in the faith of others. And this can be very misleading to you and to me, or even to the person and the student themselves, for this second type of ignorance can be very, very articulate, repeating what they have heard others say, so it sounds really great, but it's still a borrowed faith. Too often people are satisfied. The church is certainly guilty of this. Far too satisfied with this situation that if they can just repeat what we say and just carry on the traditions without causing any trouble, then it'll be fine. But it isn't theirs. And it, of course, is immediately recognized by you as being unbiblical. A university, if it is to be what it intends to be, should promote intellectual and spiritual growth of each member of the community. In terms of faith, in general terms, the university tries to open to students the possibility of, and I would say the word, trust. That is perhaps an important step. In a limited way, this means teaching which information they can trust, but this is not complete in itself either. Students need to learn that there are infinitely greater aspects of trust to be learned before they can take their place in human society. The building of trust, then, is closely related to creation of some sort of faith. And the university should, as the church, aim, quote, as Newman would say, at regenerating the very depth of the heart. Truly, a university has a rarefied atmosphere. Some people have described it to me as a hothouse environment where students and faculty search for truth in every academic discipline possible so that they may become learneds. Although the classrooms, laboratories, library, and seminar rooms are primary places for discovery and learning, it is also just as important that students, which include in this case faculty and the staff, that they frequent common rooms and coffee lounges and offices and dining halls and residences and, ideally, the chapel, so that they may interact, discuss, argue, and combine their ideas and beliefs. Newman again comments, I only say, if there be religious truth at all, we cannot shut our eyes to it without prejudice to it, the truth of every kind, physical, metaphysical, historical, and moral, for it bears upon all truth. For the Christian, it is an opportunity to understand a little deeper the exchange which Jesus had with the people around him, recorded in St. John chapter 8, verse 32, when he says, if you stand by my teaching, you are truly my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. This is a verse that I depend on quite often. It is the chapter which opens with Jesus' words, no follower of mine shall walk in darkness. He shall have the light of life. And then Jesus goes on to explain that faith in him is not a matter of just inheriting a story with a capital S, even if that story is the story of the father Abraham, very precious to the Israelites, of course. Tradition and ritual is not the content of faith, only the expression of it. Faith is a personal encounter and recognition of the truth, the fundamental truth, which has authentic authority to one's life and belief. Jesus makes this quite clear, I think, in his case, that unless one abides, I use that word in quotation marks because it appears in this section of Scripture, abide in the Word. Unless one abides in his Word, then only is he or she a true disciple. Marcus Dodds, in his exegesis of the passage in the Expositor's Greek Testament, writes this, and I think it's quite good. By abiding in Christ, and by abiding in Christ's Word, making it the rule of their life and accepting him as their guide and teacher, they would come to that knowledge of the truth which only experimental testing of it can bring. Interesting, isn't it? Because that fits in the university, doesn't it? And the truth regarding their relation to him and to God would turn all service and all life into liberty. Freedom, a condition of absolute liberty from an all outward constraint, is only attained when a person attains fellowship with God, who is absolutely free in the truth. This is truth in terms which any university, I think, can accept. Whether it believes this particular declaration or not, it can accept this overall view of truth. Personal experience and acceptance is vital to a healthy spiritual life. And to allow this to happen, there are risks which must be taken to permit the freedom of a person to explore, to question, to experience how their lives encounter spiritual things and faith as a consequence of these encounters. The risk, of course, is to allow the person to explore where they will, and perhaps missing the important material. It means that a student requires a sense of trust before taking this risk, a trust which is a beginning step of faith. On the other hand, if one is convinced that there is a profound truth in a particular belief, then that truth will eventually win the attention of the seeker, and I believe that for the Christian faith. The university chaplaincy meets people at this crossing point, where lives intersect with life experiences which have come their way, either by being sought or by happenstance. A lot of students discover faith by happenstance, or the result of their own decision and behavior, this crossing point. So now we've been talking about university as a place for growth. Growth, something desired by both spiritual and educational interests, infers that there will be a change from what is to something new. There will be an evolution and change as a direct result determined by the new information discovered, understanding, and experience. The conjunction of information and experience is critical then for, at that point, trust can exist. And this trust opens the door to truth, to faith. Last Christmas, Alex Maris, who was here tonight actually, one of our chapel assistants at Acadia, gave me a little book. It's a book by Margaret Avison called A Kind of Perseverance, which is indeed her Paschal Lectures on Christianity and the University. So you can see it came in quite handy for me tonight. In 1962, she had written a letter describing herself as being a rebel on a, in her words, a long, willful journey into darkness. But a little later on, she continued, somewhere in this effort to find her fulfilled being, a wrong self-effacement has taken place in me. I can feel the blindfold, the straitjacket, but cannot so far discover where the knots and the hooks are to undo them. I think this probably describes well many students who come to the chaplaincy to discuss these things about taking steps of faith in trust. They are looking on how to undo those knots and hooks of the spiritual straitjackets they experience. Most people, but not all, recognize that there is a spiritual dynamic in life. There is present in human life a peculiar dimension beyond physical identity. The word spirit is used and is often recognized through a sense of awe, of nature perhaps. I've had many students come in and talk about going out on the dikes, of course, out here in Wolfville. It's such a gorgeous and beautiful place, and come back. In fact, I've had chapel assistants speak very profoundly about their experiences out on the dikes and the beauty there. Spirit is often used as a word recognizing wonder and intellectual quest, how things work, in other words, in nature and so on. That's often discovered in the classroom and the laboratory. The microscope can do wonders for being wondered. Spirit is also used to describe inner realities of meaning and worth, which build often out of relationships, and especially at Acadia, which is a residential university, there's a lot of this going on. A lot of it's terribly confused and sordid, but nonetheless, it is a struggle of trying to find spirit and meaning in a relationship. And of course, love, the spirit of love, in its broadest sense, a relationship between two humans. And it reaches its deepest sense when contemplating the eternal, not unlike the well Jesus mentions to the Samaritan woman, the water I shall give will be a spring of water within him, welling up and bringing eternal life. University chaplaincy should point out that well, I think, in quotation marks, and demonstrate how one can dip into this source of water, this eternal water welling up. Or to use another analogy of St. Paul, the chaplaincy can plant and or water the seeds of faith like himself and Apollos, but it is God who makes them grow in his garden. In other words, a chaplaincy at a university is present to encourage the discovery made through awe, wonder, intellectual quest, perceiving inner realities, and love, and to devise a reasonable interpretation of these discoveries, which can be very confusing to people when they're first exposed to them. It might be added that the chaplaincy is unlikely to be present at the harvest of this growth. Remember, students are usually only present at the university for 3 or 4 years before moving on to either another university for further study or into their profession. This 3 or 4 years is a precious little time for someone completely strange to spiritual formation to develop a mature faith and standard of behavior. Nonetheless, story after story, I can tell you, could be told of the positive influences which a chaplaincy has on university students. Growth in faith formation is not confined also to individuals. It should also be a corporate experience. That's why we have chapels and things. In the age of individualism, which is something like 1996, this is something often overlooked. Mature faith development cannot remain at the individualistic level. If there is a spiritual reality to life, life includes others, and so makes it an inclusive experience. In other words, faith demands a community of like-minded, or, if you like, spirit-minded people. In the Christian faith, of course, it is the church that is that community. She is called the body of Christ, or the bride of Christ. Certainly is by St. Paul. To have any community, it needs to be built on trust, mutual trust. Obviously, the church is built on the trust we have in Jesus of Nazareth, whom we, in faith, call the Messiah, the Christ. For this reason, the university chaplaincy attempts to clarify such a community. Appreciation for academic knowledge obviously is a part of this in a skeptical world. I was just reading the highly regarded theological journal at lunchtime called The Reader's Digest. And if you've read the latest October edition anyway, you will find a little article on it called The Plague of Pessimism. I usually don't admit that I ever read this magazine, but here it is. The most deadly epidemic menacing children today is not AIDS, gang violence, or teen pregnancy. It's the plague of pessimism. Tens of millions of young people are feeling their patience tried, their faith challenged, their hopes undermined. The plague's main symptom is an orgy of whining and self-pity. I routinely visit college campuses, and with a few exceptions, I don't see a lot of shining faces and enthusiastic students. It is a skeptical world, it's an individualistic world, and the students don't come out of isolation. They are products of this now. When we look around our world, and particularly, I would add, our North American world, we can see more and more skepticism and less trust of each other. For instance, in lawmaking or in our judicial courts. How many times have you seen a lot of people, in Nova Scotia of all places, who are generally quite modest in their demonstrations, screaming about the court's ruling in many cases and complaining about their authority. People find it difficult to believe, have faith in, whatever keeps society going. Violence and law-breaking have almost become respectable. Demonstrations, strikes, and language are so violent that they break into legislatures, such as in Halifax and in Toronto. And remember, the legislature is a symbol of our civilized society of learning to trust and live together. And here are citizens breaking into them. Some others destroying company property, these people who are on strike, which endangers lives, like the cutting of telephone cables last summer and the MT&T strike, and screaming vulgarisms and blasphemies when respectful dialogue is the only way for a solution. We don't solve anything by screaming or with vulgarisms or blasphemies. We settle it by civilized discussion, and that doesn't happen at first. Growth in learning and trust includes not only the individual, but then the collective body. For spiritual people responding in faith, this begins with worship. This is the first call of a greater being, I say that advisedly, of God, in other words, to believers. The first call of God on any of us is worship. If there is a God, then obviously the first duty of people is to worship that. Everything else from that. Great disputes break over this one topic, so a university chaplaincy needs to be well informed about this matter and be alert to mistakes and misunderstandings. There are people here in this audience tonight that know I'm very alert to mistakes and misunderstandings in worship. The conduct of worship in a university, this is also in churches, but I'm making the point of university here, needs to be in a way which guarantees the best possible in theological thinking, the best avenues of worship in music, the best scripture translating, the best in prayer, the best in spiritual discipline. A university chaplaincy also needs to be well aware of the rich heritage of worship which has been used throughout the centuries by worshiping people. Universities preserve knowledge, remember? And actively preserve this treasure house of liturgy. And I hope and pray that in some way, shape, or form we do that at Acadia. To summarize the topic of growth, then, which is an essential part of university life, including the chaplaincy, let us remember that learning, the reason for being at a university, implies that there is more unknown information and experiences to be discovered and grasped. Thus, even in chaplaincy, it needs to be recognized that specific conclusions need to be qualified with new information. Chaplaincy itself needs to know the risks which must be taken during the exploration of spiritual life and place trust in the words of Jesus. And the truth shall set you free. That is the first section. Now, if I was wise and followed the example of our first lecture, I'd say now to finish up, but I'm not. Educational mission is the next section. The university is an educational institution, and the chaplaincy has a definitive role to play in this mission. This part of the growth of people in the university involves learning new things. The chaplaincy has some specific tasks to carry out. Obviously, the many regular sermons and Bible studies and lectures and so on will be a part of the educational activity of the university, but it's much more than that. Education must be one of the foundation blocks underneath all of what a university does. This is a part of what makes a university chaplaincy distinct from other forms of chaplaincy. The principle of education must be a consideration in all what a university chaplain does. Worship is an example. At Acadia, we have 12 different university services. I put that in quotation marks. That is a service sanctioned, that's a part of the university program. University services a week each term. Where else should one expect to find a liturgy which is knowledgeable of the principles and practices of worship? You see, universities are also the preservers of knowledge that it may not be lost, so that we find and if it is lost, we will just find ourselves in another dark age. The discoveries and experiences which were true to worshippers throughout history should not be lost either. Or a great treasure house of superb, conscientious, authentic acts of worship would be lost on a liturgical oak island, hidden by pirates, or, to mix a metaphor, pillaged by Philistines. Now, this is not to say that university worship is required to be archaic, but contemporary worship is incomplete unless it also acknowledges the communion of saints and integrates what others before us have found of value. In fact, this evening at 6:15, I just used one of these services. There's a little book. I have a couple here. If you want one, you can just come down and take it. I was talking to Alex after the service, and I think he was dubious anybody would want it. But there are 26 little services that I have written as a university liturgy for Acadia. In it, you will find, like tonight's, we used service 2. We had the Magnificat. How many of our young people have been in church and learned the Magnificat and its beauty and its use and proper place where it should be in the Vespers? So it's, that's what I'm talking about. But yet it's a service written here in the last year or two. In that sense, it's contemporary. Not only is there a treasure house of liturgical gems, but there has grown a knowledge and wisdom in the principles of worship. There are acknowledged and accepted attitudes and forms of worship which are deemed more reasonable and correct than others. In other words, one does not begin a service with a sermon, for example, for it would be obviously out of place. You do need to know the text upon which the sermon is based, presumably, and so the lessons are read, and so on. You would not read the epistle before you read the Old Testament, and so on like that. Over the centuries, the study of worship has offered much refinement, in the best sense, of the conduct of worship. There is no need at all in these days for chaotic liturgy in today's worship, or ignorance in how to carry out the congregation's worship of God. I might say that the Divinity College has a little newsletter called Update, which I happen to receive, and on the front page the principal writes an article, a page article. And usually it's a wonderful little homilies and so on, but lately they have been wonderful, superb little articles on worship, which has gladdened my heart. Church music. As we have already heard from Professor McCarthy's lecture and demonstration with the vocal ensemble on Tuesday evening, has a special use in worship, but it can be quite a controversy. No matter how it is done in the church, it is in fact an expression of the congregation's worship of God, music. At a university, with the gift of a school of music, as we have here, or a department of music in other places, and equipped with some of the best facilities. If you've been in the chapel, you'll understand what I mean. The beautiful building, the exquisite pipe organ, and availability of a widely experienced professional organist. The vocal ensemble, which Marie has. These are obvious things that need to be included from time to time in the use of university worship. It would be sacrilegious, I believe, to offer anything less than the best to God as a part of our worship. These are the things of which we have available to us here at the university, and we use them. Music, which has been refined over the centuries, must relate to the rational, that is, to the mind, as well as to the emotional, without fail, in what is the most suitable for university worship. University, you just don't have emotional worship without the rational, or it isn't university worship. It is inevitable that the chaplain at a university will be involved with spiritual counseling as well. Although a university usually has an excellent counseling center, such as at Acadia, a chaplain must deal with the spiritual ramifications of a whole host of crises and situations which people encounter. Again, it must be expected that a university chaplain is trained and experienced enough to see these crises through, allowing the people not only to resolve their questions, but to learn spiritual matters from them. I could keep you here longer than I am with all sorts of stories and that sort of thing. And finally, in the educational part of the university, the chaplain must be prepared to speak at other places of the university, such as classes and seminars, and particularly present the message of religion and society. In everything which the chaplain prepares, it must be done as academically as possible so that it can connect with the studies at hand. It must be expected to be argued and attacked by the students as well in an academic quest for knowledge and truth. And you must be prepared for that by those being addressed. A chaplain has to be reasonably informed about geology, like last night, biology, chemistry, physics, political science, psychology, literature, history, philosophy, music, or any of the other academic disciplines which can be encountered on a campus. And these must be integrated into spiritual belief and expressions of faith. If you don't know, like I knew nothing really of geology, I learned a lot last night about it. And that will sit in the back of my mind all while I'm here. Modeling. This is a short little section. A more abstract perspective of faith in the chaplaincy is modeling of the faith. This is basically the construction of a trust, again, which is so important to faith, as I pointed out. People watch. They do. You watch. I watch. They watch. Both consciously and unconsciously watch. They're not always looking at you just to see what you're doing, but they just unconsciously notice. And they make observations which are formative to their own faith and what they believe they can trust. And they watch the chaplain. Faith is something which needs to be nurtured as any living thing, and the nurturing is partly accomplished through being an example. You and I know that. Being a model. for those others who are still inquiring. The pressure, I must admit, is intense in the chaplaincy, for one can be observed in many situations on campus. Each one allows for the integrity of the chaplaincy to be displayed or betrayed. And often, I know when I'm around, you don't know you're being judged, but you're always being judged. And sometimes you're being judged unfairly. You don't always know you're being judged, and they don't give you an opportunity to explain what they may misunderstand. The risk is that if faith is to be on the growing edge of life, then there must be room for creativity in development and expression. And this must appear in all sorts of things, in our worship and in our mission in the university. The chaplaincy in the perspective of faith needs to tell the story of faith. As a humble illustration, I just have these little books here. I've decided last year that we would have a little publication series. And one of them is by our former chaplain, Ajahn Levy. It's some meditations that he had. And they're available up in the bookstore, but they're published by the chaplaincy department. Another one by Dr. Lovesey, Dr. Morris Lovesey this time, on C.B. Lumsden, one of our former professors, and I think a significant man that we should know more about, and so hence here's this book. Dr. Dorothy Lovesey, the Lovesey twins, has done one on Silas Rand. I heard her do that at a Bible Society meeting, and I thought it was an absolutely superb thing that should not be lost. Silas Rand has connections with Acadia, and so that should be known. Last year, we had a series of sermons in the chapel each Sunday night. One of them was given by Professor Michael Bawtry. It had a significant effect upon a lot of the students there, and so I have it published in a little booklet called A Talk About Signposts. The chapel assistants themselves have given talks, and there's a little booklet called Morning Chapel, where last year's talks, which they've given, and you find Alex is there amongst them, as sort of an expression of student faith. And I think you'll be quite surprised and moved by some of it. Here's a prayer. I did this for the chapel reunion a few years ago. Prayers by Ajahn Levy, Here and Now. Those are things that we need to do. Finally, incarnational faith. One of the delights of a university chaplain is to witness students who have come to the university and have been sincere and diligent about learning and growth as people, crossing the stage and kneeling before the university chancellor to receive recognition as worthy students. It really is very moving to me to see that, actually. These students supplicate for a degree. They're not granted to it just because they did all these courses and passed exams, much to their surprise. It's granted to them by the body. That's why they kneel before the chancellor, you see. The chancellor is like the queen, the head of state, the head of the university. He embodies the university, the professors and the staff and the students together, all of us. And they kneel before the rest of us by kneeling before the chancellor, and a degree is accorded them by being deemed worthy. Now, I know that's the ideal explanation, but that's where it comes from. And this is a rite and illustration of the faith which a chaplaincy wishes to promote. It is an incarnational faith, words which are chosen deliberately so that Christians might recognize a very important parallel. In a university, if a university is a place where people learn to incorporate as much learning as they can and let it become not only an ornament to their conversation but a part of the substance of their lives, then same with faith. If that happens, they have an incarnational faith. The ideals are established, the ethical standards and morals accepted as a result of a thorough education which should allow the person to mature, become unselfish, creative, compassionate, wise, and spiritual in all aspects. I'm actually going to just skip a little line here and just go on to a conclusion that I've drawn up here. Chaplaincy is fundamental to any special place or personal growth. In the armed forces, we find a chaplaincy corps. Hospitals, nursing homes, even airports have chaplaincies, where a ministry is provided to those with special needs. An article by Bob Harvey in the Ottawa Citizen last August is crudely headlined, "Spiritual Healing Makes Economic Sense." And he writes, "Spirituality is good medicine, and it's cheap, too. A growing body of scientific research shows those who believe in something more than their physicians not only enjoy life more, but also live longer and are healthier. They also cost the healthcare system about a third less, according to Dr. Richard Friedman, a Harvard University psychologist who studies the impact of behavioral changes on the economies of healthcare." This is true of universities as well. Universities are not summer camps or elite clubs. They are the formation ground of society's leaders in the future who have had the privilege to attain a post-education, secondary education. There are implicit responsibilities involved for those who have had these advantages. A university education is not just for the advancement of an individual, but rather society's way of developing members who will be able to make a special, possibly greater, contribution than those without this education. A university is not a vocational school, but a formation community. Faith development, then, is at the top of the list for evaluation criteria applied to students of universities. If it is not formally recognized as it once was, it is just as important in an informal way to the future of our civilization. Like the hospitals, it is time for the universities to take chaplaincy seriously, which I believe Acadia does. It is also time for spiritual communities like our churches to take it seriously too. In that same article, by Bob Harvey, it concludes, "The Vancouver Hospital has a $6 million grant from a Buddhist group to start a wellness clinic." As a Christian, I believe it is folly for the church to trivialize any chaplaincy, and particularly the university chaplaincy, or to think that it can be done as a sideline to a congregation or parish. It is not all sweetness and light. I belong to the Canadian University Chaplains Association, and Jeff Hall was at the University of Ottawa. And he wrote on, and we're on the internet, and we have a little email list, and we write back and forth to each other, very valuable. And last March, it was very sad, when he announced that 3 or 4 chaplains were being cut from the University of Ottawa because of financial constraints. It is this month, just a few days ago actually, he wrote to us that he himself is being cut at the end of this month. Tom Oosterhuis, who is university chaplain at the University of Alberta, responded in this little email thing, and this is what he said. "Now that the Harris government is in power in Ontario, it will likely become more obvious that the economistic way of life has helped to promote the crisis of the university. But the problem may not necessarily be with those people out there who want to reduce our funding, but is likely a genuine spiritual crisis within the university. Therefore, we might conclude by saying that the university chaplaincy has a distinct ministry, very different from a pastoral ministry, which has an integral part of a university's mission. Because it is misunderstood by the church so often, and often by those who are a part of the university, this chaplaincy can be in peril. Funding often is the first thing to go. And like a house of cards, the university chaplaincy can come down in an instant. The University of Ottawa is an example, but there are others close to home, and I can tell you them. The university chaplaincy should be an incubation chamber for spiritual formation, and probably will be the only time when this happens to many of these students, if they should take advantage of the opportunity while they're at university. If the church is serious about spiritual formation, it will have to take a big risk and invest in this ministry over which they have little control. It is a risk for all of us, I understand that, but especially of the Christian persuasion, for we cannot guarantee that everyone will become little Christians, let alone be formed into a particular model that we would like of the faith. But it is, in my opinion, an essential part of university life. It is a vast ministry which can affect the business, the educational, the political, the medical, and the religious leaders of our next generation. Personally, I have confidence that this is the right direction in which to spend much of our resources, not in a self-interested way, but that the people who avail themselves of a university education will not be cheated because we have failed in determination, resources, and in faith to offer a new vision, a new attitude, a new life to those who are going to make a great difference in our nation and in our world in the next half-century. Thank you.